ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله حق حمده والصلاة والسلام على خير رسله سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه. Alhamdulillah. In our class on understanding Islamic beliefs, in which we're looking at Imam Sawi's commentary on Jawhara al-Tawhid, we are, by the grace and favor of our mighty Lord, beginning the look at the attributes of affirmation, the sifat al-ma'ani. And this begins from line number 27 of Jawhara al-Tawhid. And after having looked at the first investigations of divinity, which is the investigation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's being, and that attribute or that meaning that is attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of being, which is the personal attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we looked at the 5 attributes of negation, the sifat al-salbiyya. And after looking at the attributes of negation, which are also called at-tanzihat, the investigation on transcendence, we move on to what is now affirmed about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this aspect of the tanzih, right, of the emphasis of transcendence, while affirming what is understood and affirmed about the divine, this is the balance of sound approach to Islamic beliefs, to sound approach to reality, right? And that's where we have that beautiful expression of Imam. Does the sound okay? Of Imam al-Isfirayini, that we affirm an entity that all the beliefs of Islam, all that the theologians have affirmed, goes back to 2 meanings, right? And that's a very profound statement, right? That Abu Ishaq al-Isfirayini said, "Ajma'a ahlul haqq," that the people of truth are in complete consensus regarding what? على أن جميع ما قاله المتكلمون, that all that the theologians have said في التوحيد, in divine oneness, يرجع إلى كلمتين, returns to 2 statements. What are these? إحداهما اعتقاد أن كل ما تصور في الأذهان فالله بخلافه, that anything that intellects can conceive of, right? But conceive of how? Can conceive of analogically, right? Allah is distinct from it, is, as we have seen, absolutely distinct from it. Allah is beyond all human categorization, because anything that the analogical intellect can categorize the divine by, all of that is bound by similitudes. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, لِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى, Allah's is the absolutely highest example, right? Because He has no mithal, right? So and that's also of course important now as we look at the second part. ثانيهما اعتقاد أن ذاته ليست مشبهة بذات, believing that Allah's entity does not resemble entities, ولا خالية عن صفات, and not bereft of attributes, But when we affirm the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the definitions that we will see, these affirmations are what the mind understand, the sound mind affirms with certitude about the divine, and what revelation affirms decisively about the divine. Right? So these are affirmations. Right? These are affirmations. We do not in any way claim that these are, so when we talk about the definition of such and such, we affirm what the mind affirms, and revelation affirms about the divine, these meanings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala necessarily possesses, without claiming that these are definitions in the sense that they encompass the reality of something in an absolute sense. Why? Because the mind cannot encompass the reality of the divine. لا تدركه الأفهام ولا تبلغه الأوهام. Right? Intellects cannot fathom him. Imagination cannot reach him. Right? As Imam al-Tahawi so beautifully put in his Aqidah. Okay. So he says, line number 27, وَقُدْرَةٌ إِرَادَةٌ وَغَايَرَةٌ أَمْرًا وَعِلْمًا وَالرِّضَى كَمَا ثَبَتْ. So he says in line number 27, the divine power and will, and these are distinct from his command and knowledge and good pleasure, as is well established. قوله وَقُدْرَةٌ إِلَى آخِرِهِ. So Imam Sawi says, he's saying the divine power, قال رحمه الله لما تكلم على الصفات النفسية والصفات السلبية شرع رحمه الله الآن في الكلام على الصفات المعاني. After discussing the personal attribute and the attributes of negation, the author, Imam Ibrahim al-Laqqani, the author of Jawhara al-Tawhid, begins now to talk about the attributes of meaning. Shara'a, of course, has the meaning of beginning, but shara', this is an amazing word, right? Because yes, it means beginning. What are other words that we have from the same root? Sharia is from the same root, and that's the fa'ila pattern, fa'il, which has a meaning of intensity, of the meaning. What else has? Yeah, the name for a road is a sharia, right? But the meaning for beginning is shara. And they all, and this is one of the many marvels of the Arabic language. The Arabic language is a language that is rooted in, deeply rooted in the rational. Right? The Arabs, for all their quirks at the time of revelation or after, right? It's an amazing thing, because Sharia in Arabic, a shir'a, right, is a path that is taken purposefully to an aim, to a goal. The Arabs used to use it for a trusted path that was clear, that clearly got you to water, to the life-giving. Right? And of course, in the Arabic language, and we shouldn't miss out on that, are spiritual meanings in this sense, right? That beginning is not just, well, I began doing this. No. So what are you doing? I'm just reading a book. Why? Shara'a is it's a beginning with a goal and a clarity of purpose and means. Right? And this is embedded throughout the language of revelation. Right? Okay, Shara al-an, he begins now to speak about the attributes of affirmation, sifat al-ma'ani. And we will look at a definition of these. وَقَدَّمَهَا عَلَى الْمَعْنَوِيَّةِ. And he mentions the sifat al-ma'ani first before the sifat al-ma'nawiyya لِكَوْنِهَا وُجُودِيَّةً, because the attributes of affirmation are existent. وَأَصْلًا لِلْمَعْنَوِيَّةِ, and they are a basis for the attributes of affirmation. How? Because the sifat al-ma'nawiyya, right, so the sifat al-ma'ani are meanings that are affirmed eternally for the divine. And we'll see the formal definition, right? So, for example, the sifat al-ma'ani, the affirmative attributes are Allah's life, knowledge, will, and power, and so on. The sifat al-ma'nawiyya are related to them, which are عبارة عن صفة عبارة عن قيام صفات المعاني بالذات. That when you ascribe the affirmative attributes to the entity of Allah, you would say that if Allah has the attribute of life, He is living. That is sifat al-ma'nawiyya. One is the affirmative attribute, the other are the attributes of affirmation. And they're interrelated, right? And these are mentioned primarily for two reasons. Number one, for clarification. And number two, because of some theological issues that arose. In that the Mu'tazila, one of the sects of Islam, who erred on some points, but they don't leave the fold of Islam though, right? They actually, what did they do? They negated that Allah has affirmative attributes. So they said that Allah is living, but He does not have an attribute called life. So if we say, and that's absurd, because the one who is living has the attribute of life. Right? Less like if someone, in the human context, if someone is intelligent, we say he has intelligence. So no, we say he's intelligent, but doesn't have an attribute called intelligence. And we'll see. And they did that to avoid affirming multiple eternal beings, multiple eternals. And we'll look at that. That was a vacuous argument. So the ulama affirm these just for the purpose of clarification. Right? And there's a second reason why they classified that there's attributes of the sifat al-ma'ani, there's the affirmative attributes themselves, and as-sifat al-ma'nawiyya, and the attributes of affirmation. So Allah has life, He is living. Sifat al-ma'na is al-hayat. The sifat al-ma'nawiyya, the attribute of affirmation is He is living, therefore He is living. He has knowledge, that's the attribute. He has ilm, therefore He is كونه عالما. He is alim. Another reason why they mention these two is to help us understand, to serve as a bridge from the attribute to appreciating the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Lillahi al-asma'ul husna. Allah's are the most beautiful names. Because if you appreciate that, if Allah has the attribute of qudra, right, of power, then He is كونه قادرا. He is powerful. Right? And if He is powerful, then you can appreciate that He is al-Qadir, al-Qadir, al-Muqtadir, etc. These different divine names. Right? And we'll be talking further about the relationship between names, between attributes and names. Because the attribute refers to the meaning itself that the divine entity possesses. The name is when you refer to Allah by ascribing that attribute to his entity, right? So when you say, who is the powerful? Say, who is al-Qadir? Allah, right? So you are referring to Allah by ascribing an attribute to him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then, of course, the reverse is also true, that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about his names, he is pointing us to his attributes. Right? And that's a point of reflection when we recite the Quran. Okay. وكما تسمى صفات المعاني تسمى هي الصفات الذاتية أيضا لأنها لا تنفك عن الذات، والصفات الوجودية لأنها متحققة باعتبار نفسها، وإضافة صفات للمعاني للبيان. Okay. It says, so just as these attributes are called the affirmative attributes, صفات المعاني, they're also called the essential attributes of Allah. These are attributes that Allah's essence is that are necessarily affirmed for the divine essence, right? Because they're inseparable from the divine essence. And they're also called the existent attributes, الصفات الوجودية, because the attributes of negation negate. هي عبارة عن سلب ما لا يليق بذاته تعالى. Right? The attributes of negation, they negate that which is unbefitting to ascribe to the divine. Unbefitting, i.e., unbefitting and absurd, muhal. Right? And because they're in of themselves affirmed, they're not contingent. Imam al-Tahawi expresses this beautifully, right? And we've referred to that previously. That له معنى الخالق ولا مخلوق. He has the meaning of being the creator even before there being something created. ومعنى الرازق ولا مرزوق. And he has the meaning of the provider even before there's anything to provide. And Allah does not acquire, says Imam al-Tahawi, any meaning upon creating that he did not already possess in its absolute perfection before creating. Okay. And the ascription of attributes to affirmative, this ascription, sifatul ma'ani, is lil bayan. Right? Because sifatul ma'ani, because in itself, this is to clarify, because in itself, an attribute is a meaning that an entity possesses. Right? So in that sense, these are the attributes. Right? This is what you affirm for Allah. Right? That's why in many books of theology, this section is called Mabhath al-Sifat. So they talk first about the divine entity, al-That, right? And sometimes they refer to that, what we affirm about Allah, or sometimes they refer to that as Mabahith al-Wujud, the investigations related to existence. Then they talk about tanzihat, the matters that we affirm that Allah is transcendent beyond. Are those attributes? They're attributes insofar as we ascribe, we ascribe this to Allah, we ascribe oneness to Allah, right? But what is oneness? In this sense, it is negative, right? Oneness negates. Being beginningless negates, right? But there are attributes because insofar as these are, that's why the ulama, you have to pay attention the way they define them, right? That's why writing things down and reflecting, they say, that's why they define it very carefully. Okay? That what is the, one of the multiple definitions of the negative attributes is والصفات السلبية عبارة عن سلب ما لا يليق بذاته تعالى. They negate that which is unbefitting the divine. So these are negations that are ascribed to Allah. So صفات المعاني the affirmative attribute in the Arabic language, meaning in a broader usage, ما قابل الذات is that which is distinct from the divine entity. فشمل النفسية والسلبية. So in this sense, attributes of meanings in the broad sense in the Arabic language, because in the broad sense in the Arabic language, what is a sifa? Right? A sifa is that which is ascribed to an entity in a broad sense, right? 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 So in that sense they say لأن الصفة في اللغة معنى يضاف إلى الذات. Right? Because صفة, an attribute, is a meaning that is ascribed to an entity. Okay? So صفات المعاني, right, in the broad sense, they're all attributes of meaning, because these are a meaning that is ascribed to the divine entity. So it includes a personal attribute. We ascribe the meaning of existence to Allah. The attributes of negation, we ascribe the meaning of the 5 negations, His being, beginningless, endless, distinct, independent, and one. We ascribe these to the entity of Allah. Right? In that sense, in the broad sense. And it is in this sense that some of what the early Muslims ascribed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you can see this even in the writings of Imam Abu Hanifa, and some of our attitudinally divergent brethren will selectively quote. Right? And of course, it's a funny thing because they will negate that these books are from Abu Hanifa, right? Like al-Fiqh al-Akbar and al-Fiqh al-Absat, etc. They say they're not by him, even though they're mass transmissions of them, either being authored and related by Imam Abu Hanifa, or these being what his students transmitted of the beliefs of Abu Hanifa. So they're either a transmission, an explicit transmission of his teachings, or what they understood from his teachings. And the first is what the scholars of the madhab themselves have said, and there's the argument of coherence and consistency with respect to this, and of accordance to his interpretive principles, etc. That even had we not had anything from Abu Hanifa in Aqidah, but we understand his interpretive principles, this is what we would have deduced from his principles of interpretation that he would have said in matters of belief. Because that's one of the things that made the great imams is their consistency of application of rigorous, nuanced, deep, sound principles. Okay, Bismillah. So you find in some of the writings, for example, of Imam Abu Hanifa and others, that they'll say that certain things are sifa of Allah, that al-istiwa, being established on the throne, is an attribute of Allah. Or that the hand, for example, etc., are a sifa. And this is not in the technical sense that we will see next, this in the broad lexical sense, is a ma'na yudaf ila dhat. This is a meaning ascribed to the entity. What is the nature of the ascription? Right? That is not affirmed by the primary text explicitly. Right? But it's, and we will be getting to that in its place, right? So they do not mean that they are in the technical sense, that these are meanings that Allah, that are affirmed eternally for Allah, right? In the sense that these are meanings that the divine entity eternally possesses, right? And an indication of that, for example, with the issue of istiwa being established on the ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى عَلَى الْعَرْشِ, then He was established on the throne. And if we appreciate the reality that Allah is eternal, then that then would not make sense, because time does not relate to Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we'll come to that. But فَتَأَمَّلْ, so reflect. Okay, وَاصْطِلَاحًا, what's the technical meaning of قدرة? كُلُّ صِفَةٍ قَائِمَةٍ بموصوف زائدة على الذات موجبة له حكما. Right? So صفات المعاني, right, have three aspects, right? Right? كل صفة, the first aspect is كل صفة قائمة بموصوف. The attributes of meaning, or the attributes of affirmation, are every attribute that is established by, that subsists through the one it is, and it is ascribed to, and this is بموصوف أي الذات, meaning an entity, right? Right? بموصوف زائدة على الذات, that is, so it's every attribute that subsists through what it is attributed to, i.e. the entity. زائدة على الذات, and this is that is indicates something more than the entity itself, right? It's a meaning. That word not ascribed, the entity would not have this meaning, right? زائدة على الذات. موجب له حكمة, and الحكم is الأثر المترتب على الشيء, right? الحكم is الأثر المترتب على الشيء. And there may be a more rigorous definition of what it means here, but that entails an affirmation, a ruling, literally a ruling meaning an affirmation, right? Right? How? So for example, if we say power, قدرة, right? It's one of the attributes of صفات المعاني, right? It's an attribute that subsists through what it is attributed to, right? Right? And this applies both to the eternal attributes and originated attributes. So we say Jacob's power, right? So power is an attribute that subsists through the one it is attributed to. زائدة على الذات, that is a meaning beyond the affirmation of the entity itself. That entails a hukum for it. إثبات أمر لأمر, right? 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 الموجب له حكما, يعني another, there, يعني إثبات أمر لأمر. We've seen this definition, right? It's affirming a matter for another. So it affirms something for the entity. So the divine power, that's why they define the divine power, for example, with these three meanings, right? That it is صفة وجودية قائمة بذاته تعالى زائدة على الذات يتأتى بها إيجاد كل ممكن وفق الإرادة, right? So that it is the divine power, قدرة, is an existent attribute, صفة وجودية قائمة بذاته تعالى, that subsists through the entity of Allah, because it's ascribed to the entity of Allah, right? Because الصفة لا تقوم إلا بالذات, because an attribute only subsists through an entity, right? زائدة عليها, that is, this meaning is more than the entity itself, right? The meaning of this, were it not ascribed, the entity it is ascribed to would not have that meaning in of itself, right? It is the attribute. Once you attribute the meaning, then it's ascribed. But of course, the attributes are all intrinsically necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're wajiba fi nafsi, and this is an investigation coming up. Right? That's the second part. The third part is موجب له حكما يتأتى بها إيجاد كل ممكن. By it, any possible thing is originated in accordance with the divine will. So these are the three parts of the definition, right? فخرج بقولنا قائمة بالموصوف السلبية. Meaning by, in the definition, are saying subsisting by what they're attributed to. This excludes the negative attributes. وبقولنا زائدة على الذات, that are يعني زائدة, that are more than the mere affirmation of the entity. يعني خرج النفسية, right? We exclude the personal attribute, meaning being. لأنها عين الذات, because that is affirmation of the entity itself. وبقولنا موجبة له حكمة, and are saying that they entail a meaning for him. This includes the صفات المعنوية. لأنها نفسها حكم. لأنها نفسها حكم, right? Because the attributes of affirmation are themselves the ruling, right? Al-athar. So we have the meaning, right? So when we say power, we are ascribing this meaning of ijad to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Right? And so qudra of the meaning of originating. Power originates, right? The powerful is what happens, when we say powerful, it's when we ascribe the attribute to Allah. If we ascribe power to Allah, we say He is powerful. That is the athar, that is the mujab. What is entailed by the affirming of the attributes of the affirmative attributes are the attributes of affirmation, right? And this is a general definition of the صفات المعاني. It would apply to our attributes too. وهذا التعريف للمعاني من حيث هي كانت لقديم أو حادث. This definition of the attributes, of the affirmative attributes, are in of themselves, whether they are for the eternal or the originated. وحينئذ فالفرق بين صفات القديم والحادث. Therefore, the difference in definition, i.e., between the attributes of the eternal and the originated, أن صفات القديم قديمة, that the attributes of the eternal are eternal. ولا تسمى أعراضا, and they're not called accidents. One, because that's not a term that's come in Revelation, and also because أعراض in both root meaning of the term أعراض, accidents, in the root meaning and in their technical usage, refer to meanings that can be affirmed or negated, meanings that come and go. Whereas what is affirmed for the eternal is eternal and necessary and not given to lifting. وصفات الحادث حادثة, and the attributes of the originated are themselves originated. وتسمى أعراضا, and they're also called accidents in the sense that they come and go. وبدأ رحمه الله من صفات المعاني بالقدرة ومعناها لغة القوة, and he begins with in the discussion on the affirmative attributes with power, and its meaning in that language is quwwa, is strength. Now, there is a logical order to the mention of the divine attributes, and this is min haythu ta'aqqul. This tartib is min haythu ta'aqqul. This is an order in terms of how we understand them, which would be that you affirm divine life, then knowledge, then will, then power. These are the four rationally discernible necessary attributes, and then there's three that are revelationally necessary to affirm, which are hearing, seeing, and speech. That's the logical order. He mentions in this order, one, because they're all necessary and there's no ultimate order to them. They're all eternal. This tartib is في التعقل لا في نفس الأمر. Because there's no tartib, zamani or rutbi, right? In time or in rank, right? And he says, واصطلاحا, and the technical usage, and here we would urge you to please write out the definitions of these attributes from Imam al-Bajuri's Tuhfat al-Murid. Right? They're very useful. You can also make a chart, and if we could include it here with the class, like on the Moodle, if we could make a diagram, right? In some kind of logical way. And you can, for the purpose of clarity, you could map out all the divine attributes on one chart, right? What's the definition of wujud? And we can discuss where to find it, because that's challenging. Actually, we'll not discuss, I'll just tell you. One of the nicest summaries of just the whole mataf, and it's a very useful navigational tool, because if you're interested in theology, one of the biggest questions is, what is the nature of being? And much of metaphysics and philosophy and speculative theology revolves around these discussions. Something that Sajiq Lizada complains bitterly about, having spent a lot of time on it, in Tartib al-Ulum. Imam al-Bajuri, Shaykh al-Islam, Shaykh Adib, rahimahullah, would refer to him as Khatimatul Muhaqqiqeen, right? The seal of the Imams of verification in matters of theology. Of course, that doesn't mean the absolute seal, right? Because the scholarship remains. several places in his works, but amongst them, in his Hashia on the Sanusiya, says that, the being is to affirm that he is, full stop, right? And you can see what he has to say there. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Okay. And then the definitions of the 5 attributes of negation, and the definition of the 7 attributes of, the 7 affirmative attributes, you can put them. Now the attributes of affirmation, one thing that helps is that for any of the attributes, there are 3 things that we affirm for. Right? Sifatun wujudiyatun, qa'imatun bidhatihi ta'ala, za'idatun alayha. Right? This is shared by all of the 7. Right? So if someone puts you on the spot, define kalam for me. So you take a deep breath. As you're thinking, you say, Sifatun wujudiyatun qa'imatun bidhatihi ta'ala za'idatun alayha. Right? Because all of this, you affirm about all the attributes. And you multitask, you're thinking, okay, let me gather the definition. And then you say, take another breath. And then you say what it is. Right? Right? تتعلق بالواجب والجائز والممكن تعلق دلالة. Right? You got it. Right? And the critical part is موجبة له حكمة. That is the part that is distinct from each of them. Because some people treat each one as, okay, I need to remember this whole definition. The first 2 parts of the definition, which really are 2 or 3, صفة وجودية, and some say ثبوتية, it's similar. قائمة بذاته تعالى. These are affirmative. These are existent attributes that subsist through the entity of Allah, that are more than the mere entity itself, and that's a supplementary addition. That one, you can mention it if there's a need to mention it. If there's no need, there's no need to mention it. And then what the attribute does. That's the mujiba lahu hukman. That's sort of also that's the ta'alluq. Right? What is that? What's the nature of its relationship? Right? Okay. So واصطلاحا صفة أزلية. You can say وجودية, ثبوتية, أزلية. Practically, these are essentially synonymous. قائمة بذات تعالى, that subsist through the entity of Allah. زائدة عليها, that are more than the entity itself. زائدة على الذات. يتأتى بها إيجاد كل ممكن. By it, any possible thing is originated. Right? And then he adds this, وَإِعْدَامُهُ, right? Or taken out of existence, عَلَى وُفْقِ الْإِرَادَةِ, in accordance with the divine will. Right? Then he says, وَتَعْبِيرُنَا بِالْأَزَلِيَّةِ بِأَزَلِيَّةِ دُونَ قَدِيمَةِ, says, and we use the term أزلي rather than قديم, إما بناء على أن القديم والأزلية مترادفان, either on the basis that أزلي, beginningless, and قديم, eternal, are synonymous, أو على أن الأزلية أعم من القديم, or on the basis that أزلي, beginningless, is more general than eternal. لأنه يشمل الذات والصفات والمعدوم والموجود. Right? Because some said that beginningless encompasses the entity, the attributes, and what is non-existent, and what is existent, the ma'dum and the mawjud. وتخصيص القديم بالذات الواجبة الوجود. Because some said that qadim, eternal, refers only to the divine entity. This is a matter of usage. So I said the divine entity is eternal, the attributes are beginningless. Qadim, azali. But These are matters of usage and definition. Right? You can see footnote number 1, he mentions Imam al-Bajuri, that he mentioned there are 3 positions on the relationship between Qadim and Azali. Either that right? And something like this, practically what one would do is one would make a note of it. This is not core to the text, right? So you try to master the core of the text, you note these nuances, you get the core, and then you get to the nuances. Because someone who knows the difference between Qadim and Azali, but they can't define what are the attributes, that is useless, right? That's like a tour guide who says, so tell me about the Sulaymaniya Mosque. Say, the Sulaymaniya Mosque, around the corner from it is a really good kebab house, and there's this really nice old bookstore there. So you know these details, but what is the Sulaymaniya Mosque? So it's a big mosque. Right? You don't know, that's blameworthy. Whereas if you can define the core investigation, you're showing someone, this is the Sulaymaniya Mosque. Okay, you can tell them what is the Sulaymaniya Mosque in its, precise manner, and then you can go into details. You can tell tidbits. So, the Sultan's wife, Sultan's mother, his mother-in-law, there's all these interesting incidents of why different buildings were made in the Ottoman time. You can mention all of that, but you can't mention the essentials. That's actually sifatu them. If you know both the essentials and the peripherals, that is min al-nafl, right? And that's ilmun mahbub, right? ولا يزال عبدي يتقرب إلي بالنوافل حتى أحبه. Okay. فخرج بقولنا قائمة بذاته السلبية، وبقولنا زائدة عليها النفسية، وبقولنا يتأتى بها إيجاد كل ممكن وإعدامه ما عدا المعرف. Right? So our saying established through the entity excludes the negative attributes, and our saying more than the entity itself, it excludes the personal attribute, meaning being. And by our saying, by it, all possible things are originated or extinguished or or returned to nothingness. That excludes all affirmative attributes other than the one defined. Right? Right? So that's why they say القدرة تعلقها الإيجاد. لأن تعلق الإرادة التخصيص, because the relationship of the divine will is specification, تخصيص. وتعلق العلم الانكشاف, and the relationship of knowledge is disclosure, والإحاطة, and encompassingness. وتعلق الكلام الدلالة, and the relationship of divine speech is indication. Right? It indicates meanings. والحياة لا تتعلق لها بشيء, and the divine life does not have a relationship. And here, it's a small slip, but the ulama are so careful, right? That one of the great books of the 20th century, really on a list of top 5 books of the 20th century in Islamic scholarship, the ulama would include Dr. Shaykh al-Allama al-Imam Muhammad Sa'id Ramadan al-Buti's work, Kubra al-Yaqiniyat al-Kawniyya, the greatest of the certitudes in existence. It's a brilliant work. And it's as great as it is. But here there's a small, subtle slip, but it is a slip nonetheless. He says, وَالْحَيَاةُ لَا تَتَعَلَّقُ بِشَيْءٍ دُونَهُ. Right? Or something like that, right? And this dunahu, right? The attribute of speed, of life, does not relate to anything besides him. And that dunahu is not accepted in a rigorous fashion, right? So the ulama will be very, very careful, right? About this. Why? Because talking about the divine is very sensitive, right? But of course, with balance, they would praise the book, but say just, right? We take, because he's trying to, and it's a brilliant book. There's not a criticism of the book in any way. Every talib ilm should have read that and be aware of it. Okay. وَالسَّمْعُ وَالْبَصَرُ الْإِنْكِشَافِ. Right? وتعلق الكلام الدلالة والسمع والبصر والسمع والبصر الانكشاف. You can read it in both ways. And hearing and seeing disclose. Right? And we'll see. وخرج بقولنا كل ممكن الواجبات كذات الله تعالى وصفاته. And by saying every possible thing, we're excluding the necessary. Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power relates to the possible, not to the necessary and not to the absurd. So the necessary is excluded. Yeah, Allah's power does not relate to the necessary. كَذَاتِ اللَّهِ وَصِفَاتِهِ. Like the entity of Allah and His attributes. وَالْمُسْتَحِيلَات. And absurdities. Also, the impossible, quote unquote, is excluded. كَالشَّرِيكِ وَالْوَلَدِ. Like a partner or a child. فَإِنَّ الْقُدْرَةَ لَا تَعَلُّقَ لَهَا بِهِمَا. Because the divine power does not relate to these things. Why? Let's just suppose for a second the divine power did relate to them. How would it relate to them? لأنها إن تعلقت بالواجب فإما أن تعدمه وهو محال وإما أن توجده وهو تحصيل الحاصل. Right? Because the divine power, if it related to the necessary, what is the necessary? The الواجب, and by the necessary we're saying يعني the intrinsically necessary, الواجب الذاتي, which is ما لا يقبل الانتفاء, that which does not accept negation. فهو موجود وجوبا بحيث يكون ثابتا ولا يقبل الانتفاء. It is the necessary is that which must be and cannot not be. That is what it is in its reality. So if the divine power related to it, what would it do? It would either take it out of existence, which is absurd. That's what's called qalbul haqa'iq. This is reversing realities. That's saying, can 1 equal 0? Right? Existence is 1, non-existence is 0. Saying that divine power could turn 1 equals 0. That's absurd. Because 1 is 1 and 0 is 0. And 1 cannot equal 0. So the question, like, can Allah's power, can God destroy God, for example? Can God kill himself? That's an absurd statement, right? That means, that's why when someone does that, you don't say yes or no. You have to go back to first principles. You have to go back to first principles. To appreciate the first principles, the issue is solved. And the other thing is to let the other person talk first. Say, okay, what do you mean by, or can God create, or the opposite, right? Or the other thing, the divine power could just originate the necessary, but the necessary already is. Yeah, the necessary is, must be, and cannot not be. It already is. So there's no need to originate it. It's tahsil al-hasil. Right? The tea is made. Say, I'm going to make this tea. It is already there. Like, what are you going to make about it? Right? وإن تعلقت بالمستحيلات فإما أن تتعلق بإعدامه. And if it related to the absurd, it could either cause it to cease to be, وهو تحصيل الحاصل، أو بإيجاده وهو محال. Right? Right? And if Allah's power related to the absurd, right, to the mustahil, it could either relate to taking it out of existence. But that is already the case. Why? Because what is the absurd, the impossible, is that which is not and cannot be. ما لا يقبل الثبوت. Does not accept. في ذاته, in itself. It intrinsically does not accept. So, could God create another God? And there still remains a video by someone with a fancy title online, ascribed to the Hanafi school, and they haven't taken it down, right? 100 years ago, if someone had something like that on, the ulama would say that if someone holds to this belief, it is kufr. I mean, they would advise him privately first. They would not declare him kafir. Someone holds this belief, it is kufr. They would be summoned before the qadi. The ulama would meet with him and say, you have to recant this belief and repent and publicly disassociate yourself with that view. That this person is asked, that could God create another God? And he says, of course God could create another God, because God is perfect and He can do anything. Don't take your name from titles. Don't take your name, don't take your knowledge from titles. Right? Right? Confirm, فَتَبَيَّنُوا. Be careful. Titles don't indicate knowledge. That's why actually Shaykh Salik bin Sidina, he argues that we should stop using titles full stop. Call people by their names. Okay? Just maybe use a term of respect. Let's say Sayyidi or whatever, if you want to. Right? Because, and also we have to be careful in using titles. And you have to use the titles people give. But there's difference between just being polite with people, but إِنَّ هَذَا الْأَمْرَ دِينٌ فَانْظُرُوا عَمَّنْ تَأْخُذُونَ دِينَكُمْ. This matter is your life transaction with God. So look carefully as to whom you take your religion from, right? Sometimes things seem interesting. So, some guy from Central Asia, and you get these romantic thoughts, oh my God, they preserved the rational sciences in Tajikistan, in Tashkent, whatever. The nafs tamilu lil-istighrab. The nafs likes strange things. And but he's called mullah such and such. Like, if someone called themselves the Pope, does he become the Pope? No. Someone calls himself Shaykh al-Islam, do they become the senior most scholar alive? No. Someone calls himself the Mufti of America, do they become the Mufti of America? No. Yeah. Titles are muftka, and they're free. Right? So be really careful, right? That's absurd. That indicates the person doesn't understand the basics of first principles. Right? Because God creating another God, right? So can God create a God? And or can God create a son? Right? So if you take these three parts, God, create, God. Right? So you say, there are three parts to this. How do we define God? Right? God is the necessary existent. God is, and then we affirm, reiterate what is the personal attribute, what is the personal attribute, what is negated for God. And then create. How does creating takes place? Creating is what is Allah originating with His power in accordance with His will. Right? And what is can God create a God? Now, if we look at what do we mean by God? Okay. Intrinsic to the meaning of God is that God can only be one. لو كان فيهما آلهة إلا الله لفسدتا. Right? الواجب الوجود لا يكون إلا واحدا. The necessary existent can only be one. Right? If there was another God, it's not in the realm of possibility. Yet, so if we step back, what is God? Can God create another God? Right? So what it goes back to, if you break down these three, can God who is necessary do the absurd? Right? Can the necessary be impossible? Right? Can 1 equal 0? That's just absurd. So the question itself is irreconcilable. Right? So we don't say yes and we don't say no. We say هذا السؤال محال. Right? This question is absurd. Because what it entails is, can the necessary existent, who is necessarily one without partner, eternally, manifest in time an eternal being? Right? That itself, besides the fact that there cannot be another God, but you say God is necessary existent. Can a necessary existent be created? That's absurd. Can God be more than one? That's absurd. Right? Can God be dependent? Because this other God would be dependent. It depended on God A to create him. Right? So, the question itself is absurd. The question itself is absurd. And there's no, and the different philosophical dance arounds related to that are unbefitting. Right? So he says, فَتَخَلُّفُ قُدْرَةِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى عَنْ تَعَلُّقِهَا بِالْوَاجِبِ وَالْمُسْتَحِيلِ لَيْسَ بِعَاجِزٍ. So Allah Most High's power not relating to the necessary and not relating to the absurd is not incapacity. It is simply the reality of perfection. Right? Right? بل حقيقة وكمال. Right? But it is a reality and perfection. And we'll continue from here, right? Because he then tells us, وَدَخَلَ فِي. There's two more important investigations related to the attribute of power, and we'll take them on Monday, بإذن الله تعالى. So this class is normally on Mondays at 3 p.m. and we also strive with it to cover إيضاح المبهم, شرح السلم. And we would urge you, for those of you following online, that if you could please consider expediting giving to the Islamic Scholars Fund. Give your zakat, your charity. In these turbulent times, the scholars are deeply affected around the world. The ulama, many of the ulama are in overseas, are in situations where they're not even allowed to leave home. They have no source of support right now. The madaris have shut down, many of them. Their own, if they have other sources of income, those are under question because of the institutional weakness across the ummah, but also we have freed up many of the scholars to be teaching in their communities, to be teaching students from around the world through the Islamic Scholars Fund. You can share the blog post related to that, both on YouTube and on. And if you go to seekersguidance.org/donate, this is the Islamic Scholars Fund is zakat eligible. We are short before Ramadan, and it's the best of things to do in testing times, right? That as-sadaqatu burhan, charity is proof, right? Inna sadaqa tutfi'u ghadab al-Rabb. The Prophet ﷺ said, charity extinguishes the traces of divine wrath, right? Charity is mercy. Ar-Rahimuna yarhamhum ar-Rahman. It is the merciful, said the Prophet ﷺ, whom the All-Merciful shows mercy to. Irhamu man fil ard. Be merciful to those on earth, and the Lord of the heavens will be merciful to you. Many people worry that, well, my job is threatened, my this, my that, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلْيُنْفِقْ ذُو سَعَةٍ مِّن سَعَةٍ. The one who has expansive provision, let them spend of their expansiveness. وَمَنْ قُدِرَ عَلَيْهِ رِزْقُهُ. And whoever's provision is constrained, فَلْيُنْفِقْ. Let them spend مِمَّا أَتَاهُ اللَّهُ. From what Allah has granted them, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيُرْبِ يَمْحَقُ اللَّهُ الرِّبَى وَيُرْبِ الصَّدَقَاتِ. Allah wipes away riba, usury, and He gives bounteous increase to charity, right? And at the best of charity, the ulama tell us, is that which is of the most benefit, and there's no benefit in existence like the benefit of the preservation and spread of faith and guidance. And that's what the ulama are entrusted with. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitate us to be on their footsteps and to serve their way, for it is the way of the beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So give and give generously. We have over $150,000 to raise till Ramadan to support the scholars across the world on 5 different continents. We have ulama that are being supported, that are serving their communities. And in these times, people don't need the news. People don't need all these. People need tajdeedul iman. They need the renewal of faith. Tajdeedul hidayah, renewal of guidance. They need light, and that's what the ulama preserve and spread. So please give generously and encourage friends and family. Share. Everybody's sharing all these dreary news. Let's be part of something glorious, right? لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ, so that you may attain mercy. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه والحمد لله رب العالمين. We'll be starting the next class, which is on the Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya, the path of piety, in which we look at Imam Birgavi's work, At-Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya, at 5:30 p.m. بإذن الله تعالى.